Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Community Resilience Project, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Resilience. This evening, we'll look at how different approaches to the study and understanding of resilience and how these different perspectives can be applied in our community. To join this webinar using a telephone only, dial any of the following numbers and I'll read two of them aloud. 1-888-788-0099 or 1-833-548-0282, and then slowly enter the webinar ID of 950-7355-6695. As an attendee, your microphone is muted for the entire presentation. We are not taking open mic comments. You do not need a microphone, camera, or a screen if you only want to listen to the meeting, as this meeting is accessible by landline or mobile phone. The recording and transcript of this conversation will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. If you're joining by computer, you may use the Q&A feature to type your questions or comments. Down at the bottom on the Zoom attendee control bar, you'll see the Q&A icon. In the lower left corner, you'll see audio settings. Then you'll find the Q&A icon in the middle, and then leave in a red rectangle. If you're joining using a mobile device, the Zoom control bar and Q&A icon will appear near the top of your screen. You'll see Leave Meeting in red letters in the upper left corner, then the Q&A icon, and then the three dots for more. Once the presentation begins, if you're joining by computer to see all panelists, you may need to use the Zoom control bar and select Gallery View. Depending on the size of your mobile device screen, you may need to scroll over to view whomever's speaking. If you're accessing this meeting via the web browser only or a Chromebook, you may not see all panelists at one time, only the panelists speaking. We'd like to invite you to view our next installment in the series. It's called Girls, Women, and the Media. We'll be joined by Vice Mayor Yvette Brooks, the Santa Cruz County Public Libraries, and community leaders in a dialogue about the film Misrepresentation. Head on over to santacruzpl.org and register. All of the materials and suggestions that you'll hear about this evening are available on our website, santacruzpl.org. You'll head over to our ongoing programs page, which is the second tab, Books and More. And then you'll scroll down to ongoing program resources. And then if you just scroll down the page just a bit, you'll see Community Resilience Project. You can click here and learn all about their book recommendations and find the recording of this program. Now I'm going to hand it over to UCSC lecturer and former five-time mayor of the city of Santa Cruz, Mike Rotkin. He'll introduce our program and esteemed guests. We'll transition to our panelists in gallery view, so please stand by.
Good evening, and welcome to the program. I'm really honored to be able to moderate a program of such distinguished speakers, and we'll be starting in a moment. I want to start with a recognition, a land recognition. Most of us, perhaps not all of us, because some of you may be remote, but most of us are sitting or standing on land that was occupied by the Mutsun band of the Ohlone tribe of Indians. And we want to recognize and honor their existence, which still exists today, and to thank them for the honor of being able to live in this space that we have, in many ways, not us, but many people before us have captured from them. And I think to recognize their existence is an important part of almost all public meetings at this point. Let's begin with the program. We have a program on resilience. It's something we need to talk about quite seriously in light of the COVID-19 crisis and the other crises we're facing in our communities. I think academics have something to offer in this regard. Despite the presence of some folks at the federal level, I think science does have something to offer us when it comes to how we deal in human affairs. And we have some people who have studied in particular fields that relate to the question of resilience. So we're going to start by having each of them introduce themselves briefly and tell you a little bit about the kind of work that they do. Then we're going to have a series of questions for them to respond to. And then eventually the participants who are listening in we'll have an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. And that'll happen through the Q&A function that's down on the bottom, as was explained to you earlier. And we'll explain that again when we get to that point in the program. We're expecting that the program will take about perhaps an hour in its presentation, and then we'll open it up to the questions and answers at that point. We won't have any questions and answers until we're done with the basic presentations of our panelists. So let us begin. We'll begin with Robert Strayer and have him introduce himself and tell you a little bit about the work that he does. Robert, you have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Oh, yes. My name is Robert Strayer, and it's a pleasure to be here. I am a professor of history from the state of New York. I was at the college at Rockport for a number of years. My wife and I moved out here in 2002, and out here I have taught at UCSC, Cal State Monterey Bay, and Cabrillo College. My fields of study have been varied. I have focused for a while on African history, then Soviet history, and the major thing that I have engaged with is the big picture stuff that's known as world history. And so tonight I want to bring to this discussion something of a world history perspective. It is interesting to notice the resilience of life on this planet. Life has been around for about 3.5 billion years. And multi-celled creatures have been around for about 600 million years. And so there has been a considerable resilience of life itself, despite periodic extinction events that have threatened the existence of many species. When we come to human life, it has also been amazingly resilient and successful if we measure this in terms of reproduction. Human beings have been running around the planet for about 250,000 years. Initially, our population growth was slow, but in the last century, we have quadrupled our numbers. That is something that had never happened before and pretty clearly will never happen again. So now we are at 7.8 billion, and that is some evidence to our resilience. Whether we can continue with that is a question that we will discuss later this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Now we'll hear next from Nancy Chen.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. I'm a professor of anthropology here at UC Santa Cruz, and I'm trained as a medical anthropologist. I study the worlds of medicine and culture with the lenses of politics and equity. And I want to thank the organizers and to you, the audience, for being here today in supporting our public library, as well as the pursuit of knowledge. My concept of resilience is the opportunity to share vulnerability to become stronger together. And my mom, who was an artist, made that lesson very, very clear to me when I was young and fighting with my younger brother. And she took a chopstick and broke it in half. And she said, these are the two of you, but if you work together, you can actually do things with it. So a very strong reminder of what resilience can be.
Thanks, Nancy. Next, we'll hear from Regina Longhout.
Good evening, everyone. I echo Nancy's acknowledgments and gratitude to the organizers and to the audience for being here. I am a professor in the psychology department, and I am affiliated with the social psychology area, which is organized around social justice. My field is social community psychology, and that's a little bit unique in that community psychology is focused very much on community wellness and thinking deeply about what it would mean for us to all be able to partake in and participate in sort of the good community, however we want to define that. And so from my perspective, resilience is not something that is inside of a person. That's not the way we define it in community psychology. Resilience is a set of community supports that enable people to adapt, withstand, and resist in the face of adversity. So it's very much about a setting or a context. So this definition is informed by the intersection of community psychology and disability studies. I think this is a good way to understand resilience because this approach reminds us that we live in an individualistic society and we are therefore likely to overly blame people for their circumstances. So, I mean, we only need to look at as far as how kids are doing in terms of education when they're in the classroom versus doing distance learning. We can see what a huge role that context plays in these kinds of situations. So when we take this kind of intersection of community psychology and disability studies, it reminds us to keep our focus on social factors as well. Not that we want to ignore people, but to remind us that social context always matters for how we're able to individually function. So a resilient community then is one that is an organized community that works to remove social barriers to community wellness.
Thanks, Gina. And last but not least, we'll hear from Matt Sparke.
Hey, thanks, Mike, and thanks everybody. It's a real honor for me to join you all this evening, and I'm really grateful to the organizers for setting this event up. In fact, I think it's the sort of event that makes a community more resilient, and I'm hopeful that we can discuss how as we go on. I come to this also as a professor at UCSC. I'm a professor of politics. I've been here now for 3 years. I moved here in 2017 from the University of Washington in Seattle. And I've absolutely loved the move and really appreciate my new colleagues and the community that we're located in. I've enjoyed collaborating with a number of these colleagues, including Nancy, and Nancy and I are working together to build a global and community health program at UCSC. So one of the interests I bring to this conversation this evening, like Nancy, is an interest and concern with community health. And I guess I connect that with interests and concerns with politics. I am now a professor of politics in the department here, and I'm interested in the politics of resilience and some of the troubles that we can use to explore the trouble with resilience. And I'm thinking here of trouble in the theoretical way that our Emerita colleague Donna Haraway talks about trouble as something you have to stay with. I don't want to run away from resilience because of some of the troubles that come with the concept. But I think it's worth all of us thinking about those troubles. And in a nutshell, I'll just say what I think they are, and then I'm going to talk about how I think we get around them with some examples as I talk later. But there's some problems, and Gina's really touched on these already, of individualizing the communal, of normalizing the abnormal, and of depoliticizing the political. And I think these challenges can be overcome, particularly if we take a community approach to resilience. And doing so, being led by a former politician, a mayor of Santa Cruz, makes it all the more easy to connect with politics. So I'll turn it back now to Mike.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks to all of you for your introductions. First of all, for those of you who might have joined the call a little bit late, I will tell you this one time and not interrupt again with this, but there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the talks. The panel is going to answer a number of questions that I'm going to put to them. And then we'll have an opportunity for members of the public using the Q&A that's at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer, and there's other ways that you can get to that, and you can put your questions in, and we'll basically go through those and ask them of the panel after they've done their initial presentations. So my first question has to do with models of successful and unsuccessful community resilience. It's certainly the case that we can learn from what other people have done in difficult situations, both historically and in terms of not necessarily here in Santa Cruz or even in California. And so our panelists have some knowledge about the subject, and we're going to ask them to talk to us not only about the question of what successful models are out there for community resilience, but also are there examples where communities were failed to be successfully resilient that we could learn from. So let me ask who might like to start with an answer to this question. If not, I'm going to pick one of you. I'll start with Robert, who hasn't raised his hand yet, and ask him to begin. Get the big picture view here. You have to unmute, Robert. There you go.
Yes. Okay. Let me simply say that human In the history of humankind, we have shown examples of remarkable resilience of particular societies and the vulnerability that sometimes overtakes those societies and overrides the resilience. For example, hunting and gathering societies have persisted in Australia for over 50,000 years. Now, there is an example of considerable resilience. When we come to the more recent civilizations, there is a recognizable Egyptian civilization that's been around for about 5,500 years. There is a recognizably Chinese civilization that's been in existence for maybe 4,000 years. So those are examples of long-term resilience of civilizations. There is also some capacity of human societies to exhibit resilience in the face of catastrophe. I mean, think about Europe at the end of the Second World War. They had endured a depression, 2 world wars, and you might have thought that European civilization was done for. But within the next half century, that civilization came roaring back and proved its resilience. However, on the other hand, there are some societies that have collapsed historically for which no recovery seemed possible. They had reached the limits of resilience. Just a couple of older examples. The Indus Valley in what is now Pakistan housed a remarkable civilization around 2,600 years before the Common Era, which flourished for 5, 6, 7 centuries, and then it vanished completely. It was unknown until the 20th century. Archaeologists dug it up. More recently and closer to home, Mayan civilization, so remarkable for its writing, its painting, its architecture. Mayan civilization by about 900 had just collapsed altogether in the southern highlands of that civilization. And for the Mayans, there was no recovery. Mayan civilization was over. So let me just stop there and suggest that in human history, there are examples of both remarkable resilience and of societies that reach the limits of resilience and collapse permanently.
So I'd like to ask the other panelists for comments on this broad question of like examples of communities that have been successfully resilient or societies that have been successfully resilient and so forth. Are there other responses? Not at this point. Matt, did you have a comment?
Well, I wanted to sort of telescope, well, not telescope's not the right word, I guess go back down from this very macro level that Robert introduced to something much more at the level of communities as we think of them today as a sort of subnational local communities. And mention one of the examples I wanted to introduce for as a model of good resilience practice and to share with you all. It's the model of Partners in Health, a non-governmental organization that has proved remarkably resilient as an organization, but has notably also helped communities develop resilience by fostering practices of community health work in the community that allow communities to become more agential, more able to share their own knowledge about what makes a community healthy and how individuals within it can network solidaristically to build community health. Partners in Health has done incredible work in places like Haiti, in Peru, in Rwanda, but in the midst of COVID, it's been helping Massachusetts respond to the coronavirus crisis by doing contact tracing and collaboration with the public sector to create a much more joined up pandemic response in Massachusetts. It's been quite successful comparatively with other states in bending the curve and managing the problem. And it's thanks in part to the work of Partners in Health. I won't go on too much more about this example right now, except to say that I think one of the sort of secrets to their success is their refusal as an organization to individualize the communal and to depoliticize the political. They see community health work as inherently political and also as something that goes beyond the individual, never sees health problems like COVID as something that individuals bring upon themselves, individualistically, but have to be contextualized, as Gina was suggesting, with trauma. You have to sort of put that in a larger context. And Partners in Health really is a wonderful model of doing community health in a way that builds resilience through that kind of approach.
Do any of the panelists see particular elements or issues that are helpful to communities in general, and perhaps with specific examples, but what kind of general things make a community resilient for the kinds of disasters that we're confronting? And from your research and experiences, that would be helpful, I think, if you could share some of those. Gina?
Yeah, I can share some from the community psychology empirical literature. So there are kind of 6 main characteristics of resilient communities. My answer here is a little bit long, which is why I chose not to respond to the previous question because I didn't want to take up too much airtime, so I'm going to take it now. All right, so the first is that resilient communities, the people in those communities have access to material resources. So this means that people can meet their basic needs. This includes things like access to high quality education and medical care, access to living wage jobs, affordable housing, healthy food, adequate clothing, just the basic things that we need to survive. The second characteristic or ingredient is that the community has robust institutions. So these could be schools, religious institutions, neighborhood organizations, labor unions, nonprofit organizations, grassroots groups, anything that connects people to one another and creates strong social networks that are based in dignity and respect. And in a multicultural community like ours, these spaces need to be set up so that the dominant groups practice cultural humility in those spaces, which also means that those who run these spaces should be open to hearing about changes that could be made to make the space more welcoming and inclusive for everybody in that space. The third ingredient is that there's affirmation of identity and culture. So this is especially important for groups that have been minoritized in our communities, such as people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer, gender non-binary, transgender, and so on. Groups like these should not have their identities or cultures negated, but instead should have them affirmed, because when we build more inclusive spaces, this helps to create a personal and collective sense of self and purpose. We are able to see and build from each other's strengths, aspirations, beliefs, and values. And when we build from these, we create a stronger social fabric, and with it, we are able to create community wellness. The fourth ingredient is a participatory process with shared power and control. So these include experiences of caring for ourselves and one another, and the ability to affect change in our own social and physical environment so that we can access health, education, and other community resources. And it's important that youth and children are also able to engage meaningfully in community, and we don't always do that right now in US society. Also, this means that we need spaces like city council meetings, school board meetings, parks, park activities, counseling services, immigration services, etc., to be welcoming and affirming of those who are part of the group who are accessing those resources. Number 5, I have 6, so I'm almost done, is prioritizing social justice. So this is important because the more unequal a society is, the worse the psychological and health outcomes are for everybody in that society. This means that the research is pretty clear that we don't actually live in a win-lose society, even though I think that's part of US culture to think that we are in a win-lose society. Instead, we live in a win-win society, because the more equity, the better every single person in that community does. So even if I make more than most people in my community, my own psychosocial outcomes are worse if there are people who are having a hard time putting food on the table or not able to keep a roof over their heads. So we have a lot of room to grow in this country, this state, and this community around equity. One way we can check equity is to look at something called the Genie Index, which is a measure of wealth inequality. And the number goes from 0 to 1. And the Genie Index pre-pandemic is 0.43, which represents a big income gap in our in terms of the US, and our number is the highest in terms of all of the G7 countries. And it's also the case that Santa Cruz County, our Genie Index is even higher, and it's 0.5. And again, this is pre-pandemic and pre-CZU lightning complex fire. So we can anticipate that the inequalities are going to increase even more. So this means that we have a severe income gap in our county, and this is something we really need to address if we want to think about community resilience. And then finally, number 6, the 6th key ingredient for a resilient community is community cohesion, much like Matt was speaking about with Partners in Health. So this is when we're able to balance our own personal interests with a sense of responsibility to the greater good. And this means feeling a part of something larger than our own self, both socially and spiritually. So this is important as well.
I think we see some of that problem when we look nationally, the number of people who, concerned about why they have to wear a mask and literally don't seem to appear to have a notion that how they behave affects other people. And it shouldn't be shocked by it at this point, but I am, how extensive that seems to be. It's quite amazing that people, and again, it's not just that they understand the situation and have bad values. I don't think they even see that how they behave individually has relation to other people. It's quite amazing. Do others want to speak to this question about, specific examples of what makes a community be resilient? What kinds of particular elements seem to be important? Gina's laid out 6 general areas. Are there some that you might want to emphasize among them, or other ideas as well? Yes, Nancy.
I just want to say thank you, Gina, for sharing that wonderful list, because it's actually, I think, important for not just where we are, but in many communities around the world, that those are wonderful ingredients. And as an anthropologist, I think we share similar paths in terms of thinking about the social. And I would say that, another layer in my thinking about resilience or resilient communities is the fact that I actually grew up in Louisiana, not in California. So this was hurricane country rather than wildfire. So different element, but a different shared senses of the need for community. But I just want to say that what I found interesting during this most recent climate megafire is the notion of the go box, right, or the go bag. And I just want to say that, while that is one measure of resilience, it's more about preparedness rather than responsiveness. And I think that the lessons from in New Orleans and the whole evacuation there is that it wasn't just about being prepared, it was also about being responsive for themselves, responsive for family members, responsive for community. The whole lower Ninth Ward was such an amazing place, but it was the culture that kept people going back. So even though people left, people also returned. And that return is a really important sense of belonging. And so that ingredient that Gina was talking about inclusiveness, that sense of belonging is perhaps one of the most important, I think, elements to resilience, that we belong to each other, not just to ourselves, but we belong to a place, we belong to a community, but more importantly, we also can belong to each other. And that's one of the first lessons we try to teach in Intro to Anthropology, which is kinship. How are you related to each other, whether by blood or by other relations? So I just want to say that being able to be responsive and be related, claiming relations, very much in the Donna Haraway notion of kinship, of how do you claim relations to others, it's a very symbolic and very powerful act of learning how to build community resilience.
Matt, go ahead.
Hey, I just wanted to tag along on the end of that and affirm what Nancy just said. I also think that inclusivity is key to community resilience. But I also wanted to add the sort of historical example of what happened in the lower Ninth Ward and in New Orleans more generally in the aftermath of Katrina as an illustration of failure around resilience, insofar as resilience got co-opted by elite interests that were not inclusive in the rebuilding of Katrina. After we saw these initial scenes of people sharing their solidarity in the face of crisis, and instead a lot of governmental agencies, FEMA, Homeland Security, came together with think tanks like the RAND Corporation and expert commentators or pundits like David Brooks to say Katrina basically created a blank slate in New Orleans where the city could be rebuilt to be more resilient in the future. But the problem with this sort of rebuilding vision that they then developed was that their kind of signature vision of what would make New Orleans more resilient was, would it be a competitive city? Would it attract entrepreneurs? Would it grow fast? And this was not an inclusive vision. It was a vision that was, to some extent, predicated on the sort of naturalistic logic that comes with some resilience thinking, because resilience thinking in part goes back to Crawford Hollings's work in the 1970s and sort of ecological systems modeling and so forth. And some of the interpreters of that work bring with them a kind of almost social Darwinistic outlook on what makes some communities more competitive than others. And it's not a big jump from that to then thinking what makes like some cities more competitive than others. Right. And when you saw that sort of culmination of thinking come together in New Orleans, what basically happened is a sort of wholesale gentrification of the city, the removal of a large African-American community from the heart of the city, and a non-inclusive approach to building that was basically about chasing growth numbers and going up the rankings of competitive city, excellence and friendliness to business kind of rankings. And that is resilient by some people's standards, but it's not resilient in terms of being inclusive and solidaristic. And fundamentally, it's not resilient in terms of community.
Gina?
Yeah, I just want to build on that, or maybe take it in a slightly different direction for just a minute. Matt, as you were speaking, I was thinking about my colleague at University of Puerto Rico. Her name is Irma Serrano Garcia, and she talks about also the ways that resilience has been co-opted to think and talk about Puerto Rico, especially after Hurricane Maria. And in that way, what was said was that, well, Puerto Rico has a really strong and resilient culture, so everybody's going to be okay. So basically all of those elements that are about access to material resources fell away, and people were just told, by Irma's telling that, well, you all will figure it out because you have a resilient culture. So it's also possible to lean too heavily in any one direction, and then the others fall out, and we're not going to have this community resilience unless we're attending to all of these components.
I have thought, speaking for myself, that Santa Cruz, and I don't have this quantitatively as much as sort of a qualitative sense of some of it's quantitative, but there's an amazing density of voluntary association in the city of Santa Cruz, in the community surrounding it, not just the geographical limit of the city. The number of people who belong to sports teams or discussion groups, book reading groups, whatever, is much, much higher than in most communities. And most communities, people don't know anybody else in town. They literally go to their job, they come home, they relate to their family and television. And Santa Cruz, for a number of reasons, which I don't have time to go into, but seems to have a lot more density, a lot more people who belong to something, belong to an organization. And I think it had a lot to do with the way in which we recovered from the earthquake in 1989. The idea that people knew other people, that they could check with somebody, they could sort of not have to simply become an individual going to a city council meeting or to the Vision Santa Cruz group that was set up to plan the recovery. And you could get information, you could ask questions, you could get inspired to think that you might be able to participate because of those. And a lot of them are not explicitly political. They're often cultural or, again, sports activities, things like that. But the idea that, or parents groups, but that all those kinds of connections allow people to have connections with each other that make them much more able to find a way and to participate in the process of reopening. I think also one other point, and maybe this is getting too political, but I'll say it anyway. We've set up in Santa Cruz now a process where the various businesses are involved in a group. The Santa Cruz Community Foundation set this up, and it was a good thing to set up. I think business community needs to have a way to communicate about their concerns in the recovery, but it's pretty much limited to the business community about how we should reopen, at what pace, and so forth. And a lot of voices are left out of that process by that group. In fact, our health officer, I know, has sort of been not formally disinvited, but basically made unwelcome in those meetings. And how are they going to replan the reopening? There's no education people in that group. How are we going to reopen the businesses if the people that work in the businesses don't have childcare or some alternative form of way of dealing with their children? So I think that's a good example of a non-participatory kind of, or not non, but limited participatory reopening that not very helpful to the resilience that we need to have in this particular circumstance. Those are concrete examples of that. I mean, others may disagree, but, and there are, again, other fora where people are able to speak and share their views about what ought to happen, but to have the sort of formal process that the county appointed for the reopening discussions to take place among business groups is a serious problem. And it's ironic because the County Board of Supervisors and the City Council tend to be quite progressive in their abstract views, but somehow that's the way we've opened up our process for deciding how we're going to reopen and try and rebuild our economy. And you don't rebuild an economy just on economic business issues. It's tied to the cultural questions and the social issues of how people participate and what brings your customers back. And those are not things that the businesses necessarily have the answer to. Anything else on this broad question before we move on to the next one? All right. Next question. We live in a society where I think people often, maybe this pandemic has brought it out worse than other things, a sense that there's no efficacy in human action. What can we do? It's just bigger than us. We'll have to wait it out. Something will happen. I think it leads in authoritarian cases to some people thinking, well, the president will fix it for us or something. But that they don't have a sense that they have agency or that they might be able to play some role in deciding how this is going to happen. So the question is, to what extent does resilience in recovering from various kinds of problems depend upon the resources in your community, the extent to which you are resilient, the extent to which you're prepared for dealing with disasters and so forth, versus the nature of the disaster itself? I mean, to some extent, there are disasters that are harder to overcome, in which it's harder to get on top of it, in which what we do is not quite as effective as it might be in better circumstances. And so, to what extent do you think that that agency is the key factor here? That people, the extent to which we get organized and are prepared to be resilient, is really the key factor versus the luck of the draw. How bad is this disaster? This fight, nobody planned this fire on top of the pandemic, on top of the social issues that we're having around race and other questions. And there we are, that's happening. But to what extent do you feel that we do have the ability to take some control of this process in a community? And that's an historical question as well. Robert, you have to unmute, there you go.
In 2005, Jared Diamond, the historian / anthropologist, wrote a book called Collapse. And in it, he examined a number of societies that faced considerable adversity and how they responded. And he posed a set of questions about the readiness of societies to meet their challenges based on his analysis of earlier collapses. And I thought that his questions might be relevant for us. The first one is, can we anticipate a problem before it actually arrives? Secondly, can we recognize and actively acknowledge a problem when it has arrived? Third, if we recognize the problem, can we make a serious attempt to address it? And finally, and this perhaps relates most to Mike's question, if a serious attempt is made, is there sufficient time, resources, and sustained will to make it effective? There are, I suspect, thresholds beyond which a resilient response becomes impossible. I suspect that on a global level, if we had 3 or 4 centuries to solve the problems of climate change, we could certainly do it. But the question becomes rather more problematic at the global, national, and local levels if we only have 50 years. So that raises this question about whether there are or whether we have passed certain thresholds that make a resilient response especially difficult.
Other responses to this question? The extent to which we have ability or can have ability to overcome these versus the nature of the problem itself? Nobody's jumping on that one. Nancy.
This is a really chicken or egg question, in my view. It's right. Is it event based or is it response based? And I'm going to argue that it's both. That it's important to pay close attention to how response to say climate change and the recent complex of wildfires are very much climate driven, and even one can argue the pandemic in many ways is related to human incursion into wild ecosystems that used to never be touched before, and so that unleashes new microbes, new bacteria, vectors that might cause pandemics. So it's really important to be mindful that in some ways I'm going to argue that it's going to be both, that it's about paying close attention to that dynamic relationship between experience shocks and what could be possible to respond to continue to maintain well-being. But I think Robert's point about have we reached a certain threshold, absolutely, we've already reached that threshold. And this is I think all these events that have been cataclysmic in this year alone is really an expression of that. And so, I think a lot of the question is really how far can resilience take us? Especially, as Gina and Matt have pointed out, in the case of New Orleans, resilience can very easily be co-opted. My colleague at UC San Francisco, Vincent Adams, who's also a medical anthropologist, has written a lot about Katrina, and she writes about this notion of disaster capitalism. How much of this is really wrought as a result of capitalism, and can we, move beyond that system in order to address, these events?
Right. No, I think the whole question of context becomes a very important question for us around those kinds of issues. One of the questions I'd like to ask you has to do with the leadership. In other words, once we get some idea of, and take Gina's list or the list that Robert just gave us of 3 broad kinds of areas, but who's responsible on some level for help, getting us, I mean, all of us have to play some role. That's very clear. It's not like we can just let somebody take care of it. But do you have some idea of like what to suggest might be models for who in a community leads the move towards resilience, both before the disasters happen and while you're in the process of trying to recover from various kinds of disasters? How do we conceptualize this idea of, where the initiative comes from in a way to make this happen in a community? Again, in the long term, before we face these problems, to get ready for the next, because we're not done with it after this, I'm afraid. You know, what is the role of leadership? Who or what are the appropriate places to look for that kind of leadership in establishing a resilient community? Gina?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I think that the answer is a little bit complicated. Like, I think that, you know, everybody has to be involved. Everybody has to decide. Everybody has to have a leadership role, because we're going to make better decisions if we are hearing from everybody. The people who are most impacted by the decisions or by the crisis need to also have maybe a little bit of an outsized voice around this. So I'll give you a small example. You know, in Santa Cruz, we have this slow streets movement right now, and people are voting on which streets should be slow streets. And I live near Grant Park. And Grant Park is a place where people who, at least to me, appear to be unhoused hang out. And I guess my neighbors voted to have May Street closed and to be a slow street. But that is a main thoroughfare to Grant Park. And if somebody is living in their car and needs to get access to water, one of the ways that they can do that is to come to Grant Park and refill their 5-gallon jugs or whatever. And if that street is a slow street, that makes it, you know, really challenging for people to be able to access the resources that they need, especially during a pandemic, fresh water, you know, to be able to wash your hands and whatnot. So I think, you know, everybody needs to be involved, but also those who are most impacted by the decisions, it's really important that they're involved. And it's also the case that people who are the most impacted will often have insights that the rest of us who aren't impacted are not going to have. So everybody, with an emphasis on people who are most impacted.
I don't know if you can be more, any of you can be more concrete about, say, in our community, where you would look to, for example, if you were going, let's use the word lobbying. If you were going to lobby public officials or others in power who have the power to sort of have resources to make this kind of process unfold, where would you think about going? You know, and you want to give them advice. You want to tell them, this is what we need, and this is what we're lacking. Where would you suggest that kind of an effort of sort of educating people who are perhaps already leaders, or maybe we need to establish new groups of leaders? I don't know, but what's your sense around those questions of where would you take those concerns if you were trying to, like, actually get this community to become more resilient? Matt.
Well, I'd follow what you were saying earlier yourself, Mike, the sort of idea that the guide for officials who are trying to respond should be to be as inclusive as possible. And that speaks to what Gina's just raised as an example. But you were talking about the need to include public health officials and educators in this Santa Cruz response agency organization. And I completely agree with you. I feel like that is not a very difficult argument to make, and I think it would resonate with many people. I think also that you can sort of talk about this to both citizens and leaders in ways that make it more compelling and palpable by unpacking this word responsibility a little bit more. We see in the context of COVID a kind of problematic individualization of responsibility. Like, it's your responsibility to wash your hands and wear a mask, in a way that I agree. You know, I'm washing my hands and wearing a mask with everybody else. I agree with that, and I agree with the fact that we're doing this for the collective good. But if that's the only response, it's obviously inadequate. We need a more well-organized, collaborative, coherent response at a state level, and especially what's been missing in the United States is at the federal level. And in that regard, you know, responsibility shouldn't just rest with individuals. It should be, you know, public officials taking responsibility rather than saying things like, it's a shame that 200,000 people have died. it's a pity, it is what it is. All these things Trump has said, which show a cavalier disregard for his responsibilities as president. So I think that kind of responsibility is important. But going back to what Gina and Nancy have said too, and I guess Jared Diamond also was hinting at this in Collapse. Another thing you can do with the word responsibility is think about, spell it wrong on purpose, and talk about responsibilities. How do we cultivate in society the ability to respond to all of these crises piled on top of one another? And I think that goes back, if you think about that actively as a series of responsibilities and cultivating them, it means working with educators, it means working with the sort of model that Gina laid out initially, to think through how we actually create a generation of citizens who have that capacity to respond and to work with government, rather than always either just blaming government or saying government can't solve anything and it's just down to individuals.
Points, actually. Thank you. Let me ask the question. Do you have anything that you can share with our listeners and perhaps our about to be participants about individuals? I mean, again, we've made the point that it's not purely an individual question to be resilient, but what is it that individuals can do in this overall process to be part of a more resilient community? What is it that do you have suggestions for what it is that people could do at this point who would like to have our community become more resilient and be more successful in its resilient response to the multi-crises we're facing now? Anything to suggest to people about that? Robert. You have to unmute, Robert. There you go. Now you got it.
I wanted to say just a word about personal resilience. Whether or not it is related to the community is another question, but there is a difference between where we live and where we dwell. Living has to do with those things that we are confronted with: jobs, COVID, fires, disease, sickness, and so forth. Dwelling is a matter of where we reside, where we abide, where our hearts take some comfort, where we touch something that is bigger than us. And it seems to me that personal resilience in the face of these kind of adversities that we are facing now depends on our ability to dwell in places where we do not live. We do not have to dwell always where we live. We have some choice in this matter. We can dwell for a time in a great book, in music, in poetry. We can dwell in a place of conversation with friends. We can dwell in what Thoreau referred to as sauntering. Thoreau argued he didn't understand how people could maintain their sanity unless they sauntered in the woods for 3 or 4 hours a day. Now, we may not be able to do that, but we can find places where we can touch that which is nourishing to our souls, where we can touch that which is bigger than us, where we can perhaps even touch on things that are eternal. And I think personal resilience depends on our ability to do those kinds of things.
Thank you. Other thoughts about personal resilience? Suggestions you may have for our participants here about that?
Well, I don't want to sound like I'm preaching to the choir too much, but folks who've tuned in to something like this and have joined a community, forum, I think they should be commended, and hopefully they're rewarded in a sense of personal resilience by doing things like this. I think that sort of spirit of personal inquiry, of wanting to dwell, as Robert said, in the common, in a sense of making sense of our world with others, is actually like key to personal resilience as well as our collective community resilience. And the more we can create forums like this, the better. I'm a really strong believer in that university being a place that's open to the community and, you know, and a place of universal education. That's where the word university comes from. And so I feel like university can play a role in that, but not in a top-down way, but in just collaborating and fostering these opportunities for community conversation.
I teach, Gina, go first, please.
Sure, I agree with everything that Robert and Matt have shared. In terms of dwelling, I'm reading a book right now that I'm finding really useful. It's by Lama Rod Owens, and it's about I'm not going to remember the title exactly, but it has to do with the path to liberation is through rage and love. And there's some really nice meditations in it, especially one on homecomings that I find really grounding and useful. I would say, in addition to what's been shared already about being connected, like that's super, super important, but also just in terms of personal well-being amidst everything going on, I would also say, I guess I'm going to speak now as a psychologist, keeping a schedule, including when you go to bed and what time you get up in the morning is important. Eating healthy foods, getting exercise regularly, even if we can't saunter in the woods for 3 or 4 hours a day, getting out and even walking for 30 minutes a day if the air quality allows it. If not, maybe some stretches or something inside. Connect with people who you care about and who care about you. Do something that benefits others, and use your resources. We have access to resources, use those resources.
I'll add one of my thoughts about this, which is the importance of people. I speak as a community organizer, having people have a sense that they can enter into a process, and they can't enter into it with a notion that they're going to get everything they want. You know, you start off, I want, this is what I want. I'm going to go make this group do what I want or something. And it's usually a failed process if that's where you're going to go. And particularly if everybody else comes with the same attitude. But the idea that you're going to make it, that you're going to put your oar in the water might be the metaphor here, but you know, the boat needs to move forward and you're going to be part of it, and getting some feedback that you're actually being effective in changing the, you know, whatever your contribution is in some way change the direction of the boat slightly or its speed or something else. And it seems to me that that's kind of critical in community organizing as well, that, you know, people stick with organizations and organizations grow when the members feel that that what they have to contribute is appreciated. And if you feel that you go to groups and they don't know you exist, and, you know, you go there and you show up, and even if the group's got a great goal and you care about what they're trying to accomplish, but if you feel like it doesn't matter that I'm here or not here, that tends to have people fall off in membership. The groups tend not to succeed or grow. So I think that's particularly true about resilience, that people need to have some sense that they can enter into these processes, that their input does make a difference. And again, not with the hope that they're going to get what they want, you know, in whole, but that their input's going to make a difference, that people will have heard them and that they will have had some impact on the final outcome that the organization's kind of moving towards. And I think that's important for the leaders in these processes to sort of understand that, in other words, the idea that you're going to give people a chance to give you input, but then they never get any feedback that their input has changed anything or that something's made a difference, that never feels satisfying, I don't think. And that's part of the problem with the way our governmental process, city council meetings, which I was on for 26 years, you know, people show up and they say things at the microphone for 3 minutes, and because you can't take action immediately, even if you do exactly what they want, they wouldn't know about it for another 6 months probably or something. But the idea that when you speak up in public or you go to a meeting or even an informal gathering of some kind, and again, whether it's even online, not necessarily in person, that your participation is somehow, people have heard what you've had to say, that it's made some impact on what's going on. And I think that gives people a sense of a desire to continue, and it grows. Once you've been listened to once, you have a sense, well, I'm going to go do that again. There's a satisfaction in that has people kind of commit to the process. And I don't think community organizations don't do well when the members of the groups don't feel that they control the group in that way. Again, not that they get their desires met, because that's another problem in our society. People thinking it's all or nothing. I get what I want or I don't want anything to do with you. It's not very helpful either, but the idea that you enter this process hoping to have some impact on the outcome. Any other final kind of comments before we open this up to the public? Let me just open it up for general comments about the topic that we're on, resilience. Things that didn't come up that you'd like to share with us. I'll take a long pause here, which my students hate in classes, but I'll do it anyway. Okay, Well, we now have an opportunity to hear from our members of the audience. I'm going to, basically we're using the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen if you're on a Zoom call on a computer, and you have a way to access this through your phone message, and your question will be heard. And the people that are screening these are going to give them to me in questions, and then I will forward them to our panelists. So let's open up that process. It might take us a moment to make this transition because we're just learning, all of us, how to do these kind of Zoom calls and make them work. Amazingly enough, we're actually on our schedule here, which is surprising. That doesn't usually happen. Okay, I need to click on my Q&A to see here we go. All right. So here's the first question, and this one's, some of these are directed to individuals and others, and of course others can weigh in even if it's not directed to you. But question to Robert: what are the criteria for the end of a civilization? Senderos, with its Detach membership in Santa Cruz, recently received a grant of $400,000 to focus on their indigenous language with UCSC. When I traveled to the Yucatan, Guatemala, and Belize, the majority of the population identified with their Mayan heritage and culture. So, personally, I think challenging Robert's earlier statement that Mayan culture is over, these people perhaps feel that Mixtec culture is an extension of Mayan culture and not the end of it. Robert.
Yes. Civilization and culture are two different things. Clearly, Mayan culture did not end, but Mayan civilization did. And by civilization, historians refer particularly to the writing and the inscriptions. The last known inscription in Mayan dates to 908 of the Common Era. And that seems to have marked the end of Mayan civilization. That is, these major cities, these state structures, which is what generally we mean when we speak about civilizations. Now, not all the people perished, but they deserted the cities, they organized themselves, and you could think of this as a kind of resilience. They organized themselves on a local level, maintaining their culture and their language to the present day. So there is a kind of resilience in that, but the civilization itself, structured by cities and states, disappeared.
Thanks for that clarification. This is a question from Harriet. This is open to all of you. How do you build community resilience that can withstand a greater or larger challenge from society that may impact the local community? Does Santa Cruz have structures, community agencies, or other organizations that can support or build? Whoops, the screen just slipped down on me here. That can, I'll make sure I get the question clear. Organizations that can support or build community resilience. So I think people are asking whether you perceive that there are institutions in our or organizations or things in our community that we can build upon to help us become more resilient in response to the things we're facing. Things that you've noticed or do you appreciate? You got one example earlier, but perhaps more. And I gave an example of the density of our kind of involuntary associations in the community as being, something about our community that can help us withstand these impacts. But are there other kinds of things that are positive here that we have? Gina.
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about COPA, Communities Organized for Relational Power and Action, which is a community organizing group in the Santa Cruz, Monterey, and San Benito counties. And it is affiliated with the Industrial Areas Foundation. And part of what I think is really a useful model that they have is that they are doing community organizing across social groups. And they, bring in people who experience issues from very different perspectives and then really work together to try to figure out how to move an agenda forward and how to get decision makers in our community on board with what what COPA thinks should happen, not just asking not just asking decision makers like, what can you do for us, but instead like, this is what we think needs to happen based on the research that we've done. Now, can you do that? And part of what also makes them so inclusive is that at many of their meetings, they have real-time translation. And so it doesn't matter if you're a monolingual, either English or Spanish speaker, there's always somebody there who is doing the translation as well. So I think that that's a strength that we have in this community.
Matt.
Yeah, I wanted to give a shout out to a couple of undergraduate students I've been working with who have supported by a grant from a grant system that Nancy created, have been doing some excellent work on unhoused women and their health needs in Santa Cruz, and talking to them about where they can access health resources. And one of the upshots of their research has been that there's a finding that one of the real needs is not so much the actual services, because there are a lot of excellent services available through groups ranging from Planned Parenthood to Salud para la Gente, and there's also support through the state of California that's available to people to get services. But one of the sort of missing ingredients is navigation through this incredible maze of institutional sort of complexity that exists on the ground. And just again and again, what they heard from the women that they interviewed was that they need more support in that sort of work of treatment navigation that will sort of add to their resilience. I guess in highlighting that finding, I also wanted to segue to the next question by Kimberly Garcia about women of color being disproportionately affected by higher rates of COVID, both in terms of health, but also in terms of economics and unpaid work. I think this is true. And certainly in our own community in Santa Cruz County and in Monterey County, the Latinx population has been particularly hard hit by COVID, with a disproportionate numbers of cases and hospitalizations. And across the country, people in contingent labor, in care work especially, where a lot of women of color are working, have been in that sort of overexposed area of vulnerability to COVID, and have been getting COVID more because of being essential workers, but treated to great precarity in the workplace despite being declared essential. And all I wanted to say in response to Kimberly, in a sense, is that one thing that is obviously key in responding to these health needs is to listen to the voices of these women themselves, just as my students sought to do with the unhoused women with their research. That's also one of the lessons of Partners in Health's work with the poor in Haiti and in Peru and Rwanda, is listen to the patients and their recriminations and their explanations of why they're in the situation that they're in, and learn from those complaints and concerns, rather than come in with a top-down solution.
A kind of related question, the city of Santa Cruz is about 21 or 22% Latino, or Latinx, and about 14% their primary language is Spanish. This event's being held in English. Many of the meetings that the governmental bodies hold sometimes have translators, but sometimes not. To what extent, or do you have any ideas about ways that we could sort of engage more of the library, for example, could engage more of that community in these kinds of discussions? I mean, you can see that some of the barriers there might be, I'm going to assume, a lower percentage of access to internet service and laptops and so forth that would allow people to participate. But almost everybody has smartphones. I don't have one, but almost everybody else has a smartphone. And I'm wondering whether you have ideas about whether we might be able, or the library might be able to do something in Spanish, since it's a significant percentage of our local community, even though we're not thought of as a diverse community, I think that's not an insignificant percentage of people that live here. Their primary language is not English. Nancy.
Thank you for raising that question. And I think that perhaps one of the ways in which the library can help to engage and show its commitment to this community, all members of communities in Santa Cruz County, is to perhaps feature the work of nonprofit community organizations that have actually helped to engage with Spanish-speaking communities. For instance, the Community Health Trust of Pajaro Valley, which has given out over $1 million since the beginning of the pandemic for aid and also for education in Spanish. The CAB, the Community Action Board, is another really fantastic organization that has also been very committed to day wage earners in really trying to help get the word out. In addition, Matt already mentioned Salud para la Gente, our clinic in Watsonville, which has been very, very involved. Dentists, even though it's focused on dentistry, it has also been very, very eventful and helpful. So it might be another panel potentially could be with having representatives of these different community orgs share and render visible the incredible work that they're doing in community. So I just want to say that I feel very, very honored to be here in Santa Cruz, because after the fires as well, it was really amazing to see the mutual aid and assistance. I want to get a shout out also to the chefs who really banded together to get resources to create meals, many, many meals for those who have been displaced, as well as to the firefighters coming in from all over the state as well as the country to come and help with the fires as well. And so they had to really try to get and mobilize and get a lot of food available to folks. So Second Harvest Food Bank is another wonderful community org that has really been committed to making their services available to everyone.
This is a question for, you find this for Regina. With so many people from Denise Ward, with so many people having been devastated by the experience of the fires, how do those affected recover? What programs should be offered and what criteria should be met to ensure the ability to recover? So she's asking, I think, for your ideas about, specifically what kinds of things you think would be helpful in response to, I think particularly to the fire, but perhaps the other disasters as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in terms of the fires, the steps for rebuilding as well need to be, the folks who are also affected and impacted need to also have a say in what rebuilding looks like. I know there's been some conversation in the among the different boards that govern building around just the processes that are in place and how challenging and onerous and expensive they are. So really having the people who have been, again, most affected, really being able to speak to what these processes should look like is also important. I would say in terms of trauma, the person whose work I like the most around this, his name is Ginwright, and this is one of the books that is in the list that the Santa Cruz Public Library curated from those of us who are speaking today. And it's on hope and healing, and it's the idea of like radical healing that involves both trauma-informed care, but also thinking about what justice looks like and moving forward kind of in both of these directions simultaneously. And there's some really nice research. Ginwright, he's a professor at San Francisco State, and he is working mostly with Black young people who have, just through the trauma of racism in our country, working with them to think about what does trauma-informed healing look like and what does action look like. So that's a book that's on the list that I would recommend. And you can think about like how it might apply to our situation, which parts make sense, which parts, you know, are just like culturally not appropriate to take up. But I think that this idea of healing and action together is really a way forward that I think is very generative.
Thank you. Peter Connolly asked, I think, an interesting kind of global type question that's really interesting, I think. Is America headed for a community crisis? I read a book recently called An End to the Myth that suggests America never had to face internal injustices and community issues because it had growth and exploitation of assets to distract people. Now that growth opportunity of land and resources is reduced, will the resulting internal focus result in crisis and conflict? And this is sort of a question about whether, are we ever going to get back to something like what we thought of as normal? I know we're not going back to exactly as it were, hopefully we're not. But the question is, you know, is there a path forward, or are we going to be sort of, is this life for the future in some way? That's the question to our panelists here. What's your sense of that question? Somebody wants to jump on that? I mean, you're going to get my optimism that, you know, we'll find a way to get out of this, but that's not a scientific response. I wonder to what extent people have a sense that, you know, that in fact that we're going to see more crises, that it's going to become, it'll become a bigger part of our life, and resilience is becoming a bigger issue than, I think he's right in the way that the question's posed, that things are going to become more difficult because you don't have the way to sort of solve these on the backs of others or distracted from the reality of it. So I imagine our society more and more faced, especially with difficult crises like climate change, that we're going to be facing crises more regularly and have to find a way to like exist in the face of them. But I'm curious what your responses are to this situation. Am I being too pessimistic there? Robert?
I'm not sure about your pessimism, Mike, but I think the questioner is absolutely right that the frontier in America did reduce the need to confront injustices because you could always go west, young man. But the other thing that has inhibited our ability to face these kind of issues at a national level is our very diversity. We do not have a nationality. We may have patriotism from time to time, but we don't have an American nationality. We come from so many places that makes it difficult for us to rally as a nation. Our diversity is in some ways a strength, but it can also be a drawback. We don't have the kind of unity that they have, say, in the Netherlands or Sweden or Germany, where most people are of a single ethnic background. Our diversity is very great, and it can sometimes be a difficulty.
I think, of course, countries like Germany are confronting the problem that now, because they're an Asian population, they're being forced for economic reasons to bring people from other cultures into the society, and they're not necessarily much better than we are at handling some of the conflicts that result from that reality. But I understand your point that at least there's some sort of a shared experience that's, you know, that we perhaps don't have in that way. On the other hand, as you say, it's a trade-off, because there's certainly benefits of having diversity, and it opens up possibilities of responding that are much more creative than if you're simply basing it on what you've always done or the way things have always been handled. Other responses?
Can I flip this around a little bit and say that, I mean, I think from the perspective of many more marginal communities in America, they've long been in crisis, you know, like they've been dealing with crisis for ages. I mean, we started by talking about a land recognition, but the native inhabitants of this land were soon pitched into crisis by the arrival of white colonizers. And in a way, one of the sort of hidden blessings for America is it, and I say this as an immigrant, you know, I think the country has done and can continue to learn from its diversity, and how some of these more subaltern, more marginalized communities have dealt with crises in the past. And you know, turn that kind of story around in a sense, and say how what are the multiple stories of community resilience that have endured in America, despite white supremacy and white majoritarianism and all the rest of it, and take from that some lessons for the future. I do think, though, Mike, I agree with you that right now we are, and I guess in that sense I also agree with the premise of this this question, that we are now seeing an extraordinarily large number of crises pile up, all on top of each other, for all sorts of communities, and part of the reasons for that are to do with climate crisis, to do with the kind of burdens we've placed on the land, on the earth, on the whole planet, and those are not. I mean, they're sort of literally baked in, and we know what that baking means now because of the temperature rising, and they do mean that we have to adapt. I mean, one of the critiques of resilience is that it leads to more talk in climate crisis management circles of adaptation rather than mitigation. But one of the reasons why people have switched to talking about adaptation rather than mitigation is that mitigation is increasingly not, going to, it's not plausible for a lot of the problems we've created, and we need to adapt as well. And now we see, as Nancy was saying, COVID can be understood in these sort of planetary terms as another crisis that's piled on top of the climate crisis. And then all the economic crises, I mean, we're barely coming to terms with them right now. The stock market has continued to sort of like bubble along, and people think, oh, well, the economy's okay, but talk to all the unemployed people and talk to people running state budgets who see massive hemorrhaging of resources, and they know that we're in deep trouble. And so, we have to be more adaptive. To finish up this rather speechifying moment, let me just say that I think that my watchwords for survival in this, and I do like a lot of these personal practices people have been talking about, but sort of a kind of meta-philosophical political axiom for getting by is the famous phrase from Antonio Gramsci, that we need to have a combination of the optimism of the will combined with the pessimism of the intellect, by which I think he meant that we need to be honestly pessimistic about things that are deeply problematic and difficult in our world, and yet maintain that optimism of the will that we can get through it, notably by doing it with the community.
My favorite quote, I'm glad someone brought it up. Gina, go ahead.
Yeah, I do think that we're going to have to go through this. We can't go around it. And, we are way past time in this country for a real racial reckoning. There's a podcast from On the Media that I think the title of it is something like The Worst Thing We've Ever Done. I wish they wouldn't have called it that. I wish they would have called it One of the Worst Things We've Ever Done, because there are a number of things. This one is about the enslavement of people. And what they do is they contrast what's happened in the US after emancipation versus what happened in Germany at the end of World War II. And it's so interesting to hear how basically the US and the Allies forced Germany into a reckoning that we have never had in this country. And so there's, some nice information there about the tearing down of the statues that were basically, toward Nazis, except for one that was left up, and then a much larger one was put around it to contextualize it. How there are these things called like stumbling blocks. So everywhere you go in different communities, you're constantly reminded of the history. And there's an interview with, I'm not going to remember the name of the person who opened the museum, I think it's in Alabama, around racial healing. And so there's just a lot of information there about how we could really think about a reckoning in our country. And I think that, it's really past time to do that.
I think there's now increasing literature. It's been around for a long time, but increasing literature about the way in which each opening towards emancipation, starting with the literal end of slavery, at the end of the Civil War, and how almost immediately the response to it sort of replaced it with another, it's not slavery, but other forms of oppression. And so, whereas you still have this sort of trope of people who think, can we get back to the good old days in the 50s when there weren't conflicts and there weren't problems and stuff? When of course, to live in the inner city, to live in the South in the 50s, nightmare experience for people of color, Black people particularly. And the idea that I think we're past the point where that stuff can be buried. I always think about I've been told this, I don't speak Chinese, but that the symbol for crisis in Chinese is made up of two ideograms, one of which is danger and the other which is opportunity. And so one positive way to look at the nightmare we're going through here is that it does open up an opportunity for us to reconsider the path we're on. And I would welcome that. And I think probably many of our viewers and listeners here would as well. We're getting near the end. I'm going to end with, we have a number of other great questions, which we're not going to get a chance to answer, but we all have them, and maybe we'll work this out with the people that have organized this from the Santa Cruz Public Library. If we can get these questions to be able to respond to a couple of them in writing, that would be probably good for the folks who wrote in. Back to my point, I'd like to respond to people that took the trouble to ask us a question. So I'm sure they can save those for us, and we'll find a way to write back to them by email or something. But I want to say, the last question would be, someone asked us, how are you getting through this personally? What kinds of things are keeping you sane, and or sane as you are, at least, as sane as we are? And we have time for a brief response from each of you, and I'll just do them in order. I'll just start with Gina and work our way around here. And you're asking for advice. How are you handling this situation?
Right. Well, my list is somewhat like the list that I gave earlier. I set my alarm clock almost Monday through Friday and try to get up at the same time every day. I go for a run in the woods as long as the air quality is good enough a couple of times a week. I make sure that I have my CSA and I'm eating the food that comes in my CSA as part of my healthy food eating. I connect with people. I try to get some work done every day and laugh a little bit every day. I also am involved in other organizing kinds of things, either through campus or through the broader Santa Cruz community. So that part about doing something that is of benefit in this moment. So these are all of the things that I'm doing, but also, and the book that I had mentioned by Lama Rod Owens. I've been reading that and recording some of the meditations out of it and doing the meditations as well. So yeah, I would say, and commiserating, I got, you can online on Zoom, you can get like games and you can play games with people who you're not in the same space with. So I've been doing a little bit of that too. And yeah, I think that pretty much rounds out, and playing with my dogs. Yeah, so that rounds out things for me.
Folks have pets. I've got 4 cats and 2 dogs. That's helpful. Matt, we'll go to you next. We're looking for some brief responses here.
Yeah, brief. Yeah. So what Gina laid out as a list resonates with me, and I'm doing, I guess, most of those things one way or another. But I wanted to, and I'm trying to breathe. Like there's these breathing exercises, and I'm trying to discipline myself to do more of these Andrew Weil type, breathe. Hold your breath and then breathe out really carefully and meditatively. But the other thing I'm doing just to get by is, this is a library organized panel after all, is reading fiction. And I've been reading this amazing series by Jacqueline Winspear about a character she's invented called Maisie Dobbs, who's a British detective and psychologist, she calls herself, operating mainly in the interwar years in the UK. And she's a wonderful, feisty character who has a great sort of emotional intelligence as well as regular intelligence, and so really can sort of see people for who they are. And I've loved this series. I think I'm up to like number 9 in the series now. And part of the love of it for me is that this character Maisie is moving around the landscape in which I grew up in, which is south of London, the area in Kent. So some of the stories set there, and I guess I I guess in Robert's terms, I still dwell a bit in Kent, even though I'm also dwelling here in Santa Cruz. So the books kind of reconnected me with that.
Thanks. Nancy?
Thank you so much for this question. At the beginning of this pandemic, my thoughts immediately turned to the healing powers of food as a way to build immunity, but as a foundation of resilience. And then I was reminded of the fact that a common greeting in Mandarin, traditionally people would say, "Have you eaten yet?" And so my question to most folks, my friends, my family is like, "What have you been eating?" It's really, I realize that that question is not just about food or having food. It's really about care and thinking about how the very core of food, the very essence, is really an index and an opportunity to share material and social resources. But I do like the reading lists. And so in following Matt's suggestions, I've been finding refuge in Chinese speculative science fiction. So I highly recommend Broken Stars, which is a series of edited short stories by, Ken Liu, I believe, who's the editor. And then there's another Asian American writer by the name of Ted Chiang. And I think he won a Hugo Award a couple years ago, and his novel was the premise for like a big Hollywood blockbuster arrival a couple of years ago. So
Great.
escape, I guess, is probably my way to kind of deal with it right now.
Robert?
I am trying to detach from outcomes. We are not called to be successful. We are called to be faithful. And so I sometimes think that doing our duty is a more effective guide to behavior than optimism or hope. The second thing that I have found very helpful is to seek some almost cosmic context for our actions. A book that has been very helpful to me in this is by David Hinton. David Hinton is the premier translator of Chinese poetry and philosophy. He has a very small book called Existence, a Story, in which he uses a single Chinese landscape painting from the 17th century to outline the Buddhist/Taoist outlook that has informed Chinese poetry and philosophy for many centuries. It's about 100 pages. It is philosophical in the sense that it shows how things arise, how they are transformed, how they disappear and then reappear in another form. And it came to me just after the 2016 election when I was in despair. And it afforded me a point of entry into a larger cosmic understanding of my position in life and the world that I found very comforting. I am hoping that I don't need to read it again in November, but if I do, there it is.
Thanks, Rob.
David Hinton, Existence, a Story.
Thank you. I'll give a quick response for myself. I have millions of Zoom calls because I'm a very social person and I want to be connected to people. So I find myself, doing all kinds of calls with people, and I'm much nicer than a phone call. Actually, I've decided first I didn't like them at all, and I hated them, and now I'm sort of finding it's not the same as being face to face, but it's not bad. My favorite outdoor sport is ocean kayaking, which is safe from fires and COVID-19, and all by myself out there, or with a friend that's more than 6 feet away, kayaking out on the bay or in other places, Elkhorn Slough, things like that, enjoying nature. But cooking, as Nancy was suggesting, is a big part of it. I've totally gotten into cooking for my family. And I did some cooking before, but I've definitely taken cooking seriously in a way I never had before. And I haven't gained weight. It's been interesting because I'm trying to not just fill myself up with stuff, which used to be my eating habits, but much more cook things that are interesting and eat them carefully and chew them and stuff, which I didn't used to have time for. So it's been quite a thing. Well, I want to thank our panelists, Matt Sparke, Gina Longhout, Nancy Chen, and Robert Strayer. I want to thank the Santa Cruz Public Libraries for putting this on. You're now going to see the screen's going to fill up with share screen about the next library program that's happening. And if it's technically feasible, we will try and respond to those questions that we did not respond to during this, this forum. And we'll do our best to do that. Thank you very much for participating, and thank you to the Santa Cruz Public Libraries for organizing this event.
And on behalf of the Santa Cruz Public Libraries, we do want to thank you, our distinguished panelists, for sharing your knowledge and understanding with us this evening. And of course, thank you to our viewers for making library program truly a community endeavor. And please visit santacruzpl.org and view all of our upcoming programs and resources available for free with just your library card, including the next event in this Resiliency series and our Teen Expo for those of you with teenagers looking for ways to contribute in their community. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Take care.
Everybody stay safe.